this new wave of AI companies is growing revenue, like just like actual customer revenue, actual demand translated through to dollars showing up in bank accounts at like an absolutely unprecedented takeoff rate. We're seeing companies grow much faster. I'm very skeptical that the form and shape of the products that people are using today is what they're going to be using in 5 or 10 years. I think things are going to get much more sophisticated from here. And so I think we probably have a long way to go. These are trillion-dollar questions, not answers. But once somebody proves that it's capable, it seems to not be that hard for other people to be able to catch up, even people with far less resources. When a company is confronted with fundamentally open strategic or economic questions, it's often a big problem. Companies like need to answer these questions, and if they get the answers wrong, they're really in trouble. Venture, we can bet on multiple strategies at the same time. We are aggressively investing behind every strategy that we've identified that we think has a plausible chance of working. If you want to understand people, there's basically 2 ways to understand what people are doing and thinking. One is to ask them, and then the other is to watch them. And what you often see in many areas of human activity, including politics and many different aspects of society, the answers that you get when you ask people are very different than the answers that you get when you watch them. If you run a survey or a poll of what, for example, American voters think about AI, it's just like they're all in a total panic. It's like, oh my God, this is terrible. This is awful. It's going to kill all the jobs. It's going to ruin everything. If you watch the revealed preferences, they're all using AI.
A lot of folks have sent questions ahead of time, and what I've done is kind of curated into a few different sections in an AMA this morning with Marc. So what we thought we'd do is cover 4 big topics. So AI and what's happening in the markets, policy and regulation, all things A16Z, and then we've got a fun catch-all, which we're calling sandbox of things if we get to it. So starting first, maybe with the biggest question. We're sitting in the middle of the AI revolution, Marc. What inning do you think we're in, and what are you most excited about?
First of all, I would say this is the biggest technological revolution of my life. And, hopefully I'll see more like this in the next, 30 years. But I mean, this is the big one. And just in terms of order of magnitude, like this is clearly bigger than the internet. Like the comps on this are things like the microprocessor and the steam engine and electricity. So this is a really big one. The wheel. The reason this is so big, I mean, maybe obvious to folks at this point, but I'll just go through it quickly. So if you kind of trace all the way back to the 1930s, there's a great book called Rise of the Machines that kind of goes through this. If you trace all the way back to the 1930s, there was actually a debate among the people who actually invented the computer. And it was this sort of debate between whether they kind of understood the theory of computation before they actually built the things. They had this big debate over whether the computer should be basically built in the image of what at the time were called adding machines or calculating machines. Think of sort of essentially cash registers. IBM is actually the successor company to the National Cash Register Company of America. And that was, of course, the path that the industry took, which was building these kind of hyper literal, mathematical machines, that could execute mathematical operations billions of times per second, but of course had no ability to kind of deal with human beings the way humans like to be dealt with. And so, couldn't understand, human speech, human language, and so forth. And that's the computer industry that got built over the last 80 years. And that's the computer industry that's built all the wealth of and financial returns of the computer industry over the last 80 years, across all the generations of computers from mainframes through to smartphones. But they knew at the time, they knew in the 30s, actually, they understood the basic structure of the human brain. They understood, they had a theory of sort of human cognition, and actually they had the theory of neural networks. And so they had this theory that there's actually the first neural network academic paper was published in 1943, which was over 80 years ago, which is extremely amazing. There's an interview, you can read an interview, or you can watch an interview on YouTube with these 2 authors, McCullough and Pitts, and you can watch an interview, I think, with McCullough on YouTube from 1946 or something. He was on TV, in the ancient past. And it's literally it's an amazing interview because it's him in his beach house, and for some reason he's not wearing a shirt. And he's talking about this future in which computers are going to be, built on the model of the human brain through neural networks. And that was the path not taken. And basically what happened was, the computer industry got built in the image of the adding machine. And the neural network basically didn't happen. But the neural network as an idea continued to be explored in academia and in sort of advanced research by sort of a rump, movement that was originally called cybernetics and then became known as artificial intelligence, basically for the last 80 years. And essentially it didn't work. Essentially it was basically decade after decade after decade of excessive optimism, followed by disappointment. When I was in college in the 80s, there had been a famous kind of AI boom bust cycle in the 80s in venture in Silicon Valley. It was tiny by modern standards, but it at the time was a big deal. By the time I got to college in '89, in computer science departments, AI was kind of a backwater field, and everybody kind of assumed that it was never going to happen. But the scientists kept working on it to their credit, and they built up this kind of enormous reservoir of concepts and ideas. And then basically we all saw what happened with the ChatGPT moment. All of a sudden it sort of crystallized. And it's like, oh my God, right? It turns out it works. And so that's the moment we're in now. And then really significantly, that was that was less than 3 years ago, right? That was the summer of 22. It was the Christmas of 22, and so. We're sort of 3 years in to basically what is effectively an 80-year revolution of actually being able to deliver on all the promise that the people on the alternate path, the sort of human cognition model path, kind of saw from the very beginning. And then the great news with this technology is it's kind of ultra democratized. The best AI in the world is available on ChatGPT or Grok or Gemini or these other products that you can just use. And you can just kind of see how they work. And, same thing for video. You can see with Sora and VO kind of state of the art. With that, you can see with music, you can see, Suno and IDEO and so forth. And so we're basically seeing that happen. And now Silicon Valley is responding with this just like incredible rush of enthusiasm. And, really critically, this gets to the magic of Silicon Valley, which is, Silicon Valley long since has ceased to be a place where people make silicon. That that's not long ago moved out of California and then ultimately out of the U.S. Although we're trying to bring it back now. But the great kind of virtue of Silicon Valley over the last 80 years of its existence is its ability to kind of recycle talent from previous waves of technology to new waves of technology, and then inspire an entire new generation of talent, to basically come join the project. And so Silicon Valley has this recurring pattern of being able to reallocate capital and talent and build enthusiasm and build critical mass and build funding support and build, human capital and build, everything enthusiasm, for each new wave of technology. And so that's what's happening with AI. I think probably the biggest thing I could just say is I'm surprised, I think essentially on a daily basis of what I'm seeing. We're in the fortunate position to kind of get to see it from two angles. One is we track the underlying science and kind of research work very carefully. And so I would say every day I see a new AI research paper that just completely floors me, of some new capability, or some new discovery, or some new development that I would have never anticipated, that I'm just wow, I can't believe this is happening. And then on the other side, of course, we see the flow of all of the new products and all the new startups. I would say we're routinely kind of seeing things that again kind of have my jaw on the floor. And so, it feels like we've unlocked this giant vista. I do think it's going to kind of come in fits and starts. These things are messy processes. This is an industry that kind of routinely gets out over its skis and over promises. And so, there will certainly be points where it's wow, this isn't working as well as people thought, or, wow, this turns out to be too expensive and the economics don't work or whatever. But against that, I would just say the capabilities are truly magical. And by the way, I think that's the experience that consumers are having when they use it, and I think that's the experience that businesses are having for the most part when they, when they're working on their pilots and looking at adoption, and then it translates to the underlying numbers. I mean, we're just seeing this new wave of AI companies is growing revenue, just actual customer revenue, actual demand. Translated through to dollars showing up in bank accounts, at an absolutely unprecedented takeoff rate. We're seeing companies grow much faster. The key leading AI companies and the companies that have real breakthroughs and have very compelling products are growing revenues at kind of faster than any wave I've certainly ever seen before. And so just from all that, it kind of feels like it has to be early. It's kind of hard to imagine that we've topped out in any way. It feels like everything is still developing. I mean, quite frankly, it feels like the products are still super early. I'm very skeptical that the form and shape of the products that people are using today is what they're going to be using in 5 or 10 years. I think things are going to get much more sophisticated from here. And so I think we probably have a long way to go.
Maybe on that topic. So one of the big knocks is, yes, the revenue is immense, but the expenses seem to also be keeping pace. So what are people missing as a part of that discussion and topic?
Yeah. So start with just core business models, right? And so you're right. There's basically, this industry basically has two core business models: consumer business model and the quote unquote enterprise or infrastructure business model. Look, on the consumer side, we just live in a very interesting world now where the internet exists and is fully deployed, right? And so I'll give you an example. Sometimes people ask, is AI like the internet revolution? It's well, a little bit, but the thing with the internet was we had to build the internet. Like we had to actually build the network, and we actually had to, and ultimately it involved an enormous amount of fiber in the ground, and it involved enormous numbers of like mobile cell towers, and enormous number of shipments of smartphones and tablets and laptops in order to get people on the internet. Like there was this just incredible physical lift, to do that. And by the way, people forget how long that took, right? The internet itself is a invention of the 1960s, 1970s. The consumer internet, was a new phenomenon in the early 90s. But we didn't really get broadband to the home until the 2000s. That really didn't start rolling out actually until after the dot-com crash, which is fairly amazing. And then we didn't get mobile broadband until like 2010. And people actually forget the original iPhone dropped in 2007. It didn't have broadband. It was on a narrowband 2G network. It did not have high speed, it did not have anything resembling high speed data. And so it wasn't really until, really about 15 years ago that we even had mobile broadband. So the internet was this massive lift, but the internet got built, right? And smartphones proliferated. And so the point is now you have 5 billion people on planet Earth that are on some version of, mobile broadband internet, right? And, smartphones all over the world are selling for, as little as like $10. And, you have these, amazing projects like Geo in India that are bringing, the sort of the remaining, kind of the remaining population of planet Earth that hasn't been online until now is coming online. So, so we're talking 5 billion, 6 billion, people. And then the reason I go through that is the consumer AI products could basically deploy to all of those people basically as quickly as they want to adopt, right? And so the internet's the carrier wave for AI to be able to proliferate at kind of light speed into the broad base of the global population. And let's just say that's a potential rate of proliferation of a new technology that's just far faster than has ever been possible before. Like you couldn't download electricity, right? You couldn't download you couldn't download indoor plumbing. You couldn't download television, but you can download AI. And this is what we're seeing, which is the AI consumer the AI consumer killer applications are growing at an incredible rate. And then they're monetizing really well. And again, I mentioned this already, but like generally speaking, the monetization is very good. By the way, including at higher price points. One of the things I like about about watching the AI wave is the AI companies I think are more creative on pricing than the SaaS companies and the consumer internet companies were. And so it's for example, now becoming routine to have $200 or $300 per month tiers for consumer AI, which I think is very positive because I think I think a lot of companies cap their kind of opportunity by capping their pricing kind of too low, and I think the AI companies are more willing to push that, which I think is good. So anyway, so that I think that's the reason for I would say considerable rational optimism for the scope of consumer revenues that we're going to be talking about here, and then. On the enterprise side, there the question is basically just, what is intelligence worth, right? And if you have the ability to inject more intelligence into your business, and you have the ability to do, even the most prosaic things like raise your customer service scores, increase upsells, or reduce churn, or if you have the ability to, run marketing campaigns more effectively, all of which AI is directly relevant to. These are direct business payoffs, that people are seeing already. And then if you have the opportunity to infuse AI into new products, and all of a sudden your car talks to you, and everything in the world kind of lights up and starts to get really smart. What's that worth? And again, there you kind of observe it, and you're like, wow, the leading AI infrastructure companies are growing revenues incredibly quickly. The pull is really tremendous. And so again, it feels like this just incredible. Product market fit, and the core business model, right, is actually quite interesting. The core business model is basically tokens by the drink, right? And so it's sort of tokens of intelligence, per dollar. And then by the way, this is the other fun thing is if you look at what's happening with the price of AI. The price of AI is falling much faster than Moore's law. And when I could go through that in great detail, but basically all of the inputs into AI are on a per unit basis, the costs are collapsing. And then as a consequence, there's kind of this hyperdeflation of per unit cost. And then that is driving, a more than corresponding level of demand growth, with elasticity. And so, even there, it feels like we're just at the very beginning of kind of, figuring out exactly how, expensive or cheap this stuff is getting. I mean, look, there's just no question tokens by the drink are going to get a lot cheaper from here. That's just going to drive, I think, enormous demand. And then everything in the cost structure is going to get optimized, right? And so, when people talk about the chips or, whatever, kind of the unit input costs for building AI, you now have these like the losses of blind demand are gonna kick in, right? But what's the in any market that has sort of commodity like characteristics, the number one cause of a glut is a shortage, and the number one cause of a shortage is a glut, right? And so you have, to the extent you have like shortage of GPUs or shortage of whatever inference chips or shortage of whatever data center space, if you look at just the history of humanity building things in response to demand, if there's a shortage of something that can be physically replicated, it does get replicated. And so there's going to be like just enormous build out of all. I mean, there's just hundreds of billions or at this point trillions of dollars maybe going into the ground in all these things. And so the per unit cost of the AI companies are going to drop like a rock, over the course of the next decade. And so I mean. The economic questions, of course, are very real, and of course, there's microeconomic questions around all these businesses. But the sort of macro forces that have been unleashed here, I think, are very strong. I just given the underlying value of this technology to both the consumers and the enterprise users, and given the just like incredibly aggressive discovery that's happening of all the ways that people can use this in their lives and in their businesses, like it's really hard for me to see how it both doesn't grow a lot and generate just enormous revenue.
Yeah, and actually, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago where AWS was saying like the GPUs that they've been using, they've been able to extend back to even like 7+ years. So like the shelf life also of the GPUs that they're using is now extending in ways of which they can optimize better than maybe perhaps the last couple of cycles as well. Is that the right way to think about it as well?
Yeah, that's right. And then that's one really important question and observation. And then, by the way, that also gets to this other kind of question where there's different theories on it, which is basically big models versus small models.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the data center build is oriented around hosting, training, and serving the big models, for all the obvious reasons. But there's also the small model revolution is happening at the same time. And if you just kind of track, you can get the various research firms have these charts you can get. But if you just kind of track the capability of the leading edge models over time, what you find is after 6 or 12 months, there's a small model that's just as capable. And so there's this kind of chase function that's happening, which is the capabilities of the big models are basically being shrunk down and provided at smaller size and then therefore smaller cost, quite quickly. So I'll just give you the most recent example that's just kind of hit over the last 2 weeks. And again, this is the thing that's just kind of shocking. Is there's this Chinese company that has I forget the name of the company, but it's the company that produces the model called Kimi, just spelled KIMI, which is one of the leading open source models out of China. The new version of Kimi is a reasoning model that is, at least according to the benchmark so far, is basically a replication of the reasoning capabilities of GPT-5. Right. And the reasoning models of GPT-5 were a big advance over GPT-4. And of course, GPT-5 costs a tremendous amount of money to develop and to serve. And all of a sudden, here we are, 6 months later, and you have an open source model called Kimi. And I don't know if they've had, it's either shrunk down to be able to run on either it's like 1 MacBook or 2 MacBooks. Right. And so you can all of a sudden, if you have like an application, if you're a business and you want to have a reasoning model that's GPT-5 capable, but you're not going to pay the whatever GPT-5 cost, or you're not going to want to have it be hosted and you want to run it locally, you can do that. And again, that's just like another, it's just like another, it's another breakthrough. Like it's another Tuesday, another huge advance. It's like, oh my God. And then of course it's like, all right, well, what is OpenAI going to do? Well, obviously they're going to go to GPT-6, right? Right. And so there's this kind of laddering that's happening where the entire industry is moving forward. The big models are getting more capable. The small models are kind of chasing them. And then the small models provide, completely different way to deploy, at very low price points. And so, yeah, I think, we'll see what happens. I mean, there are some very smart people in the industry who think that ultimately everything only runs in the big models because obviously the big models are always going to be the smartest, and so therefore you're always going to want the most intelligent thing, because why would you ever want something that's not the most intelligent thing for any application? The counter argument is just there's a huge number of tasks that take place in the economy and in the world that don't require Einstein. Where 120 IQ person is great. You don't need a 160 IQ PhD in string theory. You just like have somebody who's competent and capable, and it's great. And so, we've talked about this before. I tend to think the AI industry is going to be structured a lot like the computer industry ended up getting structured, which is you're going to have a small handful of basically the equivalent of supercomputers, which are these like giant, kind of we call God models that are, running in these giant data centers. And then, I'm not like convinced on this, but my kind of working assumption is what happens is then you have this cascade down of smaller models, ultimately all the way to very small models that run on embedded systems, right? Run on individual chips inside every, physical item in the world. And that, the smartest models will always be at the top, but the volume of models will actually be the smaller models that proliferate out. And right, that's what happened with microchips. It's what happened with the computers, which became microchips, and then it's what happened with operating systems and with a lot of everything else that we built in software. So, I tend to think that's what will happen. Just quickly on the chip side, again, like chips, if you look at the entire history of the chip industry, shortages become gluts, and you get just, like anytime there's a giant profit pool in a new chip category, somebody has a lead for a while and kind of gets, let's say the profits appropriate to what we call robust market share. But in time, what happens, right, is that draws competition, and of course, that's happening right now. So NVIDIA's an absolutely fantastic company, fully deserves the position that they're in, fully deserves the profits that they're generating, but they're now so valuable, generating so many profits that it's the bat signal of all time to the rest of the chip industry to figure out how to advance the state of the art in AI chips. And that's already, by the way, and that's already happening, right? And so you've got other major companies like AMD coming at them, and then you've got, really significantly, you've got the hyperscalers building their own chips. And so, a bunch of those kind of big tech companies are building their own chips. And of course, then the Chinese are building their own chips as well. And so it's like pretty likely in 5 years that AI chips will be, cheap and plentiful, at least in comparison to the situation today. Which again, I think will tend to be extremely positive for the economics of the kinds of companies that we invest in.
And the startups are also starting to go after new chip design as well, which is exciting.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing is, you have these disruptive startups, and actually, that just for a moment on the chips, we're not really big investors in chips because it's kind of a big company thing, but it's a little bit of historical happenstance that AI is running on quote unquote GPUs, which a GPU stands for graphical processing unit. So. And basically, just for people who haven't tracked this, there were basically two kinds of chips that made the personal computer happen. The so-called CPU, central processing unit, which classically was the Intel x86 chip. That's kind of the brain of the computer. And then there was this other kind of chip called the GPU, or graphical processing unit, that was the sort of second chip in every PC that does all the graphics. And this is graphics like 3D graphics for gaming or for CAD CAM or for anything else, Photoshop, or for anything that involves lots of visuals. And so the kind of canonical architecture for a personal computer was a CPU and a GPU. By the way, same thing for smartphones. But by the way, and over time, these have kind of merged. And so like a lot of CPUs now have GPU capability built in. Actually, a lot of GPUs now have CPU capability built in. So this has gotten fuzzy over time, but like that was like the classic breakdown. But the fact that was the classic breakdown, kind of meant that while Intel had a, monopoly for a long time on CPUs, there was this other market of GPUs, which NVIDIA basically fought the GPU wars for 30 years and came out the winner, like what was the best company in the space. But it was like a hyper-competitive market for graphics processors. It was actually not that high margin. It was actually not that big. And then basically, it turned out that there were two other forms of computation that were incredibly valuable that happened to be massively parallel in how they operate, which happen to be very good fits for the GPU architecture. And those two basically highly lucrative additional applications were cryptocurrency, starting about 15 years ago, and then AI starting about 4 years ago. And so NVIDIA, like I would say, very cleverly set itself up with an architecture that works very well for this. But it's also just a little bit of a twist of fate that it just turns out that if AI is the killer app, it just turns out that the GPU architecture is the best legacy architecture that's devoted to it. I go through that to say, like, if you were designing AI chips from scratch today, you wouldn't build a full GPU. You would build dedicated AI chips that were much more specifically adapted to AI, and would have, I think, would just be much more economically efficient. And Jen, to your point, there are startups that are actually building entirely new kinds of chips oriented specifically for AI. And we'll have to see what happens there. It's hard to build a new chip company from scratch. It's possible that one or more of those startups makes it on their own. And some of them are, doing very well. It's also possible, of course, that they get bought, by big companies that have the ability to scale them. And so, we'll see exactly how that unfolds. And of course, we'll also, by the way, see, the Koreans are going to play here for sure. The Japanese are going to play, and then, the Chinese in a major way. As well, and they have their own native chip ecosystem that they're building up, and so there are going to be many choices of AI chips in the future, and it's going to be that'll be a giant battle. That'll be a giant battle that we observe very carefully, and that we make sure that our companies basically are able to take full advantage of.
While on the topic of international, you mentioned Kimi earlier, so it seems like some of the best open source models today are from China. Should this be worrisome to folks? How are you thinking and talking about this topic with folks in DC? I know you were just there last week. how much of this is a concern for U.S. companies, particularly just having seen the rise of China do unnatural things in solar markets, car markets? Are they kind of flooding the ecosystem so that they can eventually kind of take share and increasingly own the ecosystem?
Yeah, so a couple things. So one is, you want to start these discussions by just kind of saying, like, look, there's vigorous debate in the U.S. and around the world of like, how much are we in a new Cold War with China, and exactly like how hostile, should we view them? And it's very tempting, by the way. It's very tempting, and I think it's a very good case to be made that we're in like a new Cold War that's like, that in a lot of ways is like the U.S. versus USSR in the 20th century. It is the counter argument would be it is more complicated than that, because the U.S. and the USSR were never really intertwined from a trade standpoint, and a big part of that, quite frankly, was the USSR never really made anything that anybody else needed, I guess, other than weapons. But like, the USSR's primary exports were literally like wheat and oil. Whereas, of course, China exports just a tremendous number of physical things, right? Including like a huge part of like the entire supply chain of parts that basically go into everything that American manufacturers, kind of make, right? And so by the time a U.S., by the time an American company brings a toy to market, right, or or a car, or anything, or a computer or a smartphone or whatever, like it's got a lot of componentry in it that was made in China. So there is a much tighter interlinkage between the American and Chinese economies than there was the American and Soviet economies. And maybe Adam Smith or whatever might say that's good news for peace, and that both countries need each other. By the way, the other part of that argument is that the Chinese governance model is based on high employment. Because if at least all the geopolitical people say if China ended up with like 25 or 50% unemployment, that would cause civil unrest, which is the one thing that the CCP doesn't want. And so the corresponding part of the trade pressure is China needs the American export market. The American consumer is like a third of the global economy, a third of global consumer demand. And so, China needs the U.S. export market, or it has all of a sudden, a lot of its factories would go kind of instantly bankrupt, and, would cause mass unemployment and unrest in China. So anyway, like, there is this complicated, it's a complicated, intertwined relationship. Having said that, the mood in DC basically for the last 10 years on a bipartisan basis has been that we, the U.S. need to take China more seriously as a geopolitical foe. And under that school of thought, there's there's the military dimension, which is this sort of the risk of some kind of war in the South China Sea, the risk of some kind of war around Taiwan, and so that that has everybody in Washington on high alert. There's also this economic question around the kind of deindustrialization of the U.S. and the potential reindustrialization, and what that means about dependence on China. And then there's this AI question, and the AI question is an economic question, but it's also like a geopolitical question, which is, okay, basically AI is essentially only being built in the U.S. and in China. The rest of the world either can't build it or doesn't want to, which we could talk about. So it's basically U.S. versus China, and then AI is going to proliferate all over the world. And is it going to be American AI that proliferates all over the world, or is it going to be Chinese AI that proliferates all over the world? And I would say just generally across party lines in DC, this, the things I just went through are kind of how they look at it. And the Chinese are in the game. And so the Chinese are in the game for sure, with software, DeepSeek, was kind of the big, fired the starting gun in the software race. And now you've got, I think you've got four, it's like DeepSeek, which is DeepSeek is an AI model from actually a hedge fund in China. It's a little bit kind of took a lot of people by surprise. Then Quen is the model from Alibaba. Kimi is from another startup called Moonshot. The company's called Moonshot. And then there's there's also Tencent and Baidu and ByteDance, that are all primary companies doing a lot of work in AI. And so there's somewhere between 3 to 6 kind of primary AI companies, and then there's tremendous numbers of startups. And so, they're in the race on software. They are, working to catch up on chips. They're not there yet, but they're working incredibly hard to catch up. And just as an example of that, at least the common understanding, in the U.S. is that the reason you haven't seen the new version of DeepSeek yet is that basically the Chinese government has instructed them to build it only on Chinese chips, as a motivator to get the Chinese chip ecosystem up and running. And the main chip company there is Huawei, although there could be more in the future. And then there's so there's that, and then there's everything to follow, which is basically AI in kind of robotic form, right? And so there's this basically global technological, economic, robotics competition that's kicking off. China kind of starts out ahead on robotics because they're just ahead on so many of the components that go into robots. Because this sort of, like I said, the kind of entire supply chain of like electromechanical things, basically moved from the U.S. to China 30 years ago and has never come back. So that's kind of the DC lens on it. And I would say, DC is watching it, quite carefully. The big kind of supernova moment this year was the DeepSeek release. The DeepSeek release was surprising on a number of fronts. One was just how good it was, and again, along this line of it took the capability set that we're running in large models in the cloud and kind of shrunk it onto a sort of a reduced size, a smaller version with sort of equivalent capabilities that you could run on small amounts of local hardware. And so there was that. And then it was also a surprise that it was released as open source, and particularly open source from China, because China does not have a long history of open source. And then it was also a surprise that it actually came from a hedge fund. So it didn't come from a big R&D, sort of university research lab. It didn't come from a big tech company. It came from a hedge fund, and it like as far as we can tell, it basically is this somewhat idiosyncratic situation where you just have this incredibly successful quant hedge fund with all these super geniuses, and the founder of that hedge fund basically decided to build AI. And at least external indications are this was a surprise to even the Chinese government. It's impossible to prove what the Chinese government was surprised by or not, but there's at least the atmospherics are that this was not exactly planned. This was not a national champion tech company at the time that DeepSeek was released. It sort of came out of left field, which, by the way, is very encouraging for the field that it was possible for somebody to do that kind of who was unknown, right? Because it kind of means that maybe you don't need all these super genius, superstar researchers. Maybe actually smart kids can just build this stuff, which I think is the direction things are headed. And so that kicked off, I would say, like this kind of, I don't know, copycat's the wrong word, but that was sort of, it feels like the success of DeepSeek and the success of DeepSeek from China as open source kind of kicked off a sort of trend in China of releasing these open source models. Look, the cynics, in DC would say, like they're dumping, right? They're obviously dumping. They're trying to, they see that the West has this opportunity to build this giant industry. They're trying to commoditize it right out of the gate. There's probably something to that. The Chinese industrial economy does have a history of, sort of, let's say, subsidized production that leads to selling things below cost in some cases. But I think also I think that's almost too cynical of a view also, because it's just like, all right, wow, like they're really in the race, like open source, closed source, whatever, like that, they're actually really in the race. We've talked in the past, I think on LP calls about, these policy fights that, we've been having in DC for the last 2 years. And, there was a pretty big push within the US government, 2 years ago to basically, restrict, or outright ban, a lot of AI. And it's very easy for a country that is the only game in town to have those conversations. It's quite another thing if you're actually in a foot race with China. And so I think actually the policy landscape in DC has, I would say, has improved dramatically as a consequence of sort of an awareness now that this is actually a 2-horse race, not a 1-horse race.
For sure. Yeah, actually, on the point, I'll jump ahead here to policy and regulation, just because it seems like the current stance on 50 different set of AI laws by state seems like a catastrophic way to put us effectively with one of our hands tied behind our back here in terms of the AI race. What's the state of play on that? Are folks recognizing that would be catastrophic for progress and development? Where do most people at least stand on that topic today?
Yeah, so it's a little bit complicated. So I'll rewind to say, like 2 years ago, I was very worried about like really ruinous federal legislation on AI, and we engaged kind of very heavily at that point, which we talked about in the past. And I think the good news on that is I think the risk of that sitting here today is very low. There's very little mood in DC on either side of the aisle to really, essentially there's very little interest in doing anything that would prevent us from beating China. On the federal side, things are much better now. There will be issues and there are tensions in the system, but like things are looking pretty good. That has translated, Jen, to your point, that's translated a lot of the attention to the states. And basically what's happened is, under our system of federalism, the states get to pass their own laws on a lot of things. Basically, a lot of, with these things, it's always a combination. A lot of well-meaning people are trying to figure out what to do at the state level. And then, of course, there's a lot of opportunism where AI is just the hot topic. And so if you're a, aggressive up and coming state legislator or whatever in some state and you want to run for governor and then president, you want to kind of attach yourself to the heat. And so there's like a political motivation to do state level stuff. Yeah, and sitting here today, like we're tracking on the order of 1,200 bills across the 50 states. And by the way, not just the blue states, also the red states. And so, I've, for the last like 5 years or whatever, I spent a lot of time complaining about, kind of what Democratic politicians are threatening to do to tech. There's also a lot of Republicans like Republicans are not a block on this. And there are quite a few like local Republican officials in different states that also I think have, let's say, misinformed or ill-advised views and are trying to put out bad bills. It's a little bit weird that this is happening and that, the federal government does have regulation of interstate commerce. And, technology, AI kind of by definition is interstate. Like, there's no AI company that just operates in California or just operates in, Colorado or Texas. AI of all technologies, AI is obviously something that's sort of national in scope. It's sort of obvious that the federal government should be the regulator, not the states. But the federal government needs to assert itself, needs to step in. There was actually an attempt to do that. There was an attempt to add a moratorium on state level AI regulation that basically would reserve the right of the federal government to regulate AI and sort of prevent the states from moving forward with these bills. That was, I think, part of the negotiation for the quote one big beautiful bill, and then that there was a deal behind that, and that deal kind of blew up at the last minute, and that moratorium didn't happen. And in fairness, the critics of that moratorium, it probably was probably too much of a stretch. It was definitely too much of a stretch to get enough support to pass, but it was also probably too much of a stretch in terms of restricting the states from certain kinds of regulation that they really should be able to do. So it didn't quite come together. We're having very active discussions in DC right now about kind of the next, the kind of the next turn on that. The administration is very supportive of the idea of the federal government being in charge of this, as part of it being an actual, 50 state issue, and an issue of national importance. And then, I'd say most Congress people on both sides of the aisle, kind of get this. So we kind of have to figure out a way to land this, but I think that'll happen. Some of the state level bills are wild. The Colorado passed a very draconian regulation bill last year, and against like furious objections from the local startup ecosystem in and around Denver and Boulder. And actually, they're now actually trying to reverse their way out of that bill. A year later.
Maybe some of the nuance of it, like the algorithmic discrimination and like how to mitigate. Like, what were some of the extreme versions of what they had proposed?
Yeah, so the really draconian one was the one that we really fought hard was the one in California, which was called SB 1047, and it was basically modeled basically after it was called the EU AI Act, so the European Union's AI Act. Okay, and this is the backdrop to all the U.S. stuff, which is the EU passed this bill called the AI Act, I don't know, whatever, 2 years ago, and it basically has killed AI development. It's actually killed AI development in Europe to a large extent. And then it's so draconian that even big American companies like Apple and Meta are not launching leading edge AI capabilities in their products in Europe. Like that's how like draconian that bill was. And it's sort of a classic. It's a classic kind of European thing where they they just thought that, they have this kind of view that it's just like, well, if we can't be the leader, they literally say this, by the way, if we can't be the leaders in innovation, at least we can be the leaders in regulation. And then they pass this like incredibly, kind of ruinous self-harm, kind of thing. And then, a few years pass and they're like, oh my God, what have we done? And so they're kind of going through their own version of that. By the way, when I talk about Europe, I tend to be very dark about the whole thing. I will tell you the darkest people I know about Europe are the European entrepreneurs who moved to the U.S. Are just like absolutely furious about what's happening in Europe on this stuff. But even there, like it's so bad in Europe, like they shot themselves in the foot so badly that there's actually a process now at the EU to try to unwind that. They're trying to unwind the GDPR. So anyway, for people tracking Europe, Mario Draghi, is the former, I guess, Prime Minister of Italy, did this thing about a year ago called the Draghi Report, which is the report on European competitiveness. And he kind of outlined kind of in great detail all the ways that Europe was holding itself back, and part of it was overregulation in areas like AI. So they're trying to reverse out of that, or making gestures. We'll see what happens. In the middle of all that, California sort of inexplicably decided to basically copycat the EU AI Act and try to apply it to California, which might strike you as completely insane, to which I would say, yes, welcome to California. It was this like Sacramento political dynamic that kind of got crazy. It would have, completely killed, AI development in California. Fortunately, our governor vetoed it at the last minute. It did pass both houses of the legislature that he vetoed at the last minute. Jen, to your point, it would have done a whole bunch of things that were ruinously bad. But one of the things it would have done is it would have assigned downstream liability to open source developers. And so, we talked about, the Chinese open source thing. Okay, so you got Chinese out there with open source. Now you're going to have American companies that have open source AI. And by the way, you're also going to have American academics and just like independent people in their nights and weekends developing open source, which is a key way that all this technology proliferates. And so this law would have assigned downstream liability to any misuse of open source to the original developer of the open source. And so, you're an independent developer or you're an academic or you're a startup, you develop and release an AI model. The AI model works fine. The day you release it, it's great. But like 5 years later, it gets built into a nuclear power plant. And then there's a meltdown at the nuclear power plant. And then somebody says, oh, it's the fault of the AI. The legal liability for the nuclear meltdown or for any other practical real world thing that would follow in the out years would then be assigned back to that open source developer. Of course, this is completely insane. It would completely kill open source. It would completely kill startups doing open source. It would completely kill academic research, like in its entirety. Anything in the field. And so, that's the level of playing with fire. Kind of that these state level politicians have become enamored with. Like I said, I think the good news is the feds understand this. I suspect that this is going to get resolved, but it does need to get resolved because just as a country, it just doesn't make any sense to let the states kind of operate suicidally like this. And so. That's what we're doing. We talk about this. We call this our little tech agenda. We're extremely focused on the freedom of startups to innovate. We are not trying to argue, many other issues. We operate in a completely bipartisan fashion. We have extensive support, on both sides of the aisle and for both sides of the aisle. So it's a truly bipartisan effort, very policy based, and I think very much aligned with the interests of the country broadly. And so that is what we're doing. And then the other question we get actually, in some cases from LPs, but in a lot of cases actually from employees, is like, okay, why us, right? Like, with any sort of, policy question like this, there's always this collective action question, which is this like, tragedy of the commons, which is in theory, like everybody, every venture firm, every tech company, whatever should be weighing in on these things. In practice, what happens is most of them just simply don't. And so at some point it falls on somebody's shoulders to fight these things. And Ben and I just basically concluded that the stakes here were just way too high. If we're going to be the industry leader, we just have to take responsibility for our own destiny. For better or for worse, I think that's the cost of doing business for being the leader in the field right now.
Before we get off the topic of AI, I want to go back to one question that was submitted in. So do you think usage-based or utility is the right way to price an AI compared to seats?
That is a fantastic question. So this is one of these this is in my list of what I call the $1 trillion questions, where, depending on how this is answered, will drive, trillions of dollars in market value. So yeah, so usage-based pricing, it's actually fairly amazing. If you think about this from a startup standpoint, from a venture standpoint, it's actually fairly amazing what's happened. And I'm not really talking about this in public because I don't want it to stop. I think it's actually quite amazing. Which is you have these technology companies, these big tech companies with these like incredible R&D capabilities that are building these big models, these big AI models with this incredible, new kind of intelligence. And then it turns out that they were already in a war. They were already in the cloud war, right? And so they were already in the war for kind of cloud services. And this is like AWS versus Azure versus Google Cloud, and then all these other cloud efforts. And so what actually happened was they sort of like there's an alternate universe in which they basically just kept all of their magic AI secret and captive and just used it in their own business, or used it to just compete with more companies, in more categories. But instead, what they've done is they've basically, if commoditize is too strong a word, but they have proliferated their magic new technology through their cloud business, which is this business that just has these like incredible scale, kind of components to it, and sort of this hyper competition between the providers and these prices that come down very fast. And so you've got like the most magic new technology in the world, and then it's basically being served up by those companies as a cloud business and made basically available to everybody on the planet to just click and use, and for like relatively small amounts of money. And then on a usage basis, which means, and usage is great for startups because it means you can start easily, right? There's basically no fixed cost. For a startup building an AI app, they don't have giant fixed costs because they could just tap into the OpenAI or Anthropic or Google or Microsoft or whatever, cloud, tokens by the drink, intelligence tokens by the drink offering, and just get going. And so it's kind of this from the startup standpoint, it's like this marvelous thing where like the most magical thing in the world is available by the drink. it's absolutely amazing. That model, by the way, that model's working and those companies are happy and they're growing really fast and they're, happily reporting massive cloud revenue growth and, they're happy with the margins and so forth. And so, I think generally it's working. And those businesses are, I think, likely to get much larger. And so I think, generally that's going to work. But to the question, like that doesn't mean that the optimal pricing model for example, all of the applications should be tokens by the drink. And in fact, very much, I think, not the case. We spend a lot of time working. We actually have, dedicated, experts on pricing in our firm. We spend a lot of time with our companies working on pricing because it's really this magical art and science that a lot of companies don't take seriously enough. So we spend a lot of time with our companies on this. And of course, a core principle of pricing is you don't want to price by cost. If you can avoid it, you want to price by value, right? You want to price, you have price where you're getting a percentage of the business value especially when you're selling two businesses, you want to price as a percentage of the business value that you're getting. And so you do have some AI startups that are pricing by the drink for certain things that they're doing, but you have many others that are exploring other pricing models. Some that are just like replications of SaaS pricing models, but you also have other companies that are exploring pricing models, for example, of, well, if the AI can actually do the job of a coder, or the AI could do the job of a doctor or a nurse or a radiologist or a lawyer or a paralegal, right, or whatever, or a teacher, basically, can you price by value, and can you get a percentage of the value of what otherwise would have been literally a person, or by the way, equivalently, can you price by marginal productivity? So if you can take a human doctor and make them much more productive because you give them AI, can you price as a percentage of kind of the productivity uplift? From the augment, the symbiotic relationship between the human being and the AI. And so I think what we see in startup land is like a lot of experimentation happening on these pricing models. And I think, again, I think that's like super healthy. I was in this little speech on this is like high prices are really underappreciated. High prices are often a favor to the customer. It's actually really funny. A lot of like the naive view on pricing is the lower the price, the better it is for the customer. The more sophisticated way of looking at it is higher prices are often good for the customer because a higher price means that the vendor can make the product better, faster, right? Like you can actually, the companies with higher prices, higher margins can actually invest more in R&D and they can actually make the product better. And most people who buy things aren't just looking for the cheapest price. They want something that's going to work really well. And so often high prices, the customer doesn't ever say this. It'll never show up in a survey. But the high price can actually be a gift to the customer because it can make the vendor better, can make the product better, and ultimately make the customer better off. And so I'm very encouraged by the degree to which the AI entrepreneurs are willing to run these experiments. And we'll have to see where it pans out. But at least so far, I feel good about the at least the attitude in the industry about it.
Awesome. I actually, as you were going through it, I had probably 10 more follow-up questions, but I'm actually going to go back to a topic you had briefly, the $1 trillion questions. Will open source or closed source win? Feels like we've come out on this debate, or where do you put that?
No, I think this is still open. I think this is still very open. The closed source models keep getting better. Mm-hmm. By the way, if you just like take the temperature of the people working at the big labs who work on the big proprietary models, like generally what they'll tell you is progress is continuing at a very rapid pace. Mm-hmm. There's this periodic concern that kind of shows up online, which is, or in the market, which is like, maybe the capabilities these models are topping out. There's certain areas in which people are working on, but like the people working at the big labs are like, oh no, we have like 800 new ideas. Like we have tons of new ideas. We have tons of new ways of doing things. We might need to find new ways to scale, but like we have a lot of ideas on how to do that. We know a lot of ways to make these things better, and we're basically making new discoveries all the time. So, like I would say, generally the people working like across all the big labs are pretty optimistic. And so, like I think the big models are going to continue to get better, very quickly here, and then overall, and then the open source models continue to get better. And like I said, every month or something, there's like another big release of like something like this Kimmy thing. Where it's just like, wow, like, that's amazing. And, wow, they really like shrunk that down and got that capability on a very small form factor. And so, that's the case. And then, maybe just the third kind of thing to bring up is the other really nice benefit of open source is that open source is the thing that's easy to learn from. Right. And so if you're a computer science professor who wants to teach a class on CS, on AI, or if you're a computer science student that's trying to learn about it, or if you're just like a normal engineer in a normal company trying to learn this new thing, or just somebody in your, by the way, somebody in your basement at night with a startup idea, the existence of these state-of-the-art open source models is amazing because that's the education that you need. Like these open source models actually show you how to do everything. Right. And so what that's leading to, right, is the proliferation of the knowledge about how to build AI is like expanding very fast. Again, as compared to a counterfactual world in which it was all basically bottled up in 2 or 3 big companies. And so, the open source thing is also just proliferating knowledge, and then that knowledge is generating a lot of new people. And so as you guys have all seen, sitting here today, AI researchers are at an enormous premium. AI researchers today are getting paid more than professional athletes, right? Like, and that's right. That's the supply demand imbalance. There aren't enough of them to go around. But again, shortages create gluts. The number of smart people in the world who are coming up to speed very quickly on how to build these things. I mean, some of the best AI people in the world are like 22, 23, 24. Like they kind of by definition, they haven't been in the field that long. They can't have been experts their whole lives, right? So they kind of have to have come up to speed over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. And if they've been able to do that, then there's going to be a lot more in the future that are going to do that. And so just the sort of spread of the level of expertise on this technology is happening now very quickly. I think it's still, like I said, I think it's still a race. And by the way, look, the long-term answer may well just be both. Like I said, if you believe my pyramid industry structure, then there will certainly be a large business of whatever is the smartest thing, almost regardless of how much it costs. But there will also be this just giant volume market of smaller models everywhere, which is what we're also seeing.
Yep. Another question you had posed at that point in time was, will incumbents versus startups win? And at that point in time, I think there was a mixed bag of where the incumbents were approaching AI. I think that's radically changed in the last 2 years. And then on the counterexample, the blossoming of startups increasingly now maybe migrating into the incumbent category, just how big they've become since that time. You want to take that question and give your assessment of where the state of the world is?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, big companies that are definitely, playing hard, Google's playing hard, Meta's playing hard, Amazon, Microsoft, there's a bunch of these companies that are, that are kind of in there, very aggressively. And then you've got these, what we call the new incumbents like Anthropic and OpenAI. But you also have even in the last 2 years, you've had this birth of all of a sudden like brand new companies that are almost instant incumbents. And you could say XAI is one of those. Mistral. By the way, Mistral is the great outlier to my Europe thing from earlier. Like Mistral is actually doing very well as sort of the European kind of French national European continental kind of AI champion. Sort of the exception that proves the rule. But there's a bunch of these now that are like doing quite well and are kind of becoming new incumbents. And then of course there's tons of startups. By the way, there's actual foundation model startups, right? And so we funded Ilya Sutskever out of OpenAI to do a new foundation model company. We funded Mira Murati also out of OpenAI. We funded Fei Li out of Stanford to do a world model foundation model company. And so there are new swings all early but very promising to kind of build new incumbents quickly. And so that's all happening. And then on top of that, there's just this giant explosion of AI application companies, right? And so there's basically companies that then usually startups that basically take the technology and then field it in a specific domain, whether that's law or medicine or education or creativity or whatever. But again, here it's just like it's amazing kind of how sophisticated things are getting very quickly. So let's talk about the application companies for a moment. So like an application company, like classic examples like a Cursor is like an application company. So they take the core AI capability, which they purchase by the drink from Anthropic or OpenAI or Google, tokens by the drink, and then they build basically a code editor, what we used to call an IDE. Integrated development environment, or basically like a software creation system. So they build like an AI coding system on top of the Anthropic or OpenAI or whatever, kind of big models and field that. And the critique of those companies in the industry has been, those are what are called GPT wrappers. It's kind of the pejorative. And the idea basically being is, well, they're not actually doing anything that's going to preserve value, because the whole point of what they're doing is they're surfacing AI, but it's not their AI. The AI that's being surfaced is from somebody else. And so these are kind of these pass-through shell things that ultimately won't have value. It actually turns out what's happening is kind of the opposite of that, which is the leading AI application companies like Cursor. I mean, first of all, what they're discovering is they're not just using a single AI model. They actually, as these products get more sophisticated, they actually end up using many different kinds of models that are kind of custom tailored to the specific aspects of how these products work. And so they may start out using one model, but they end up using a dozen models. And then in the fullness of time, it might be 50 or 100 different models for different aspects of the product, A. And then B, they end up building a lot of their own models. And so a lot of these, the leading edge application companies are actually backward integrating and actually building their own AI models because they have the deepest understanding of their domain. They're able to build the model that's best suited to that. And then, by the way, also AI, open source, they're also able to pick up and run on open source models. And so if they don't like the economics of buying intelligence, by the drink from a cloud service provider, they can pick up one of these open source models and implement it instead, which these companies are also doing. And so the best of the AI application companies are actually full-fledged deep technology companies actually building their own AI. And so that's, I think,
small models though, right, Mark? When you think about God models versus small models, as you were describing that would be small. Would you categorize that as a small?
Well, some of them, I mean, I will let them announce, whatever they're doing whenever it's appropriate. But some of them are now also doing big model development. And again, this is also part of the learning just in the last 2 years. Well, so here's a big learning just in the last 2 years, which is very interesting, which is 2 years ago or 3 years ago, for sure, you would have said, wow, OpenAI is way out ahead. And it's probably going to be impossible for anybody to catch up. And then it's okay, well, Anthropic caught up. And so, but they came out of OpenAI. And so they had all the secrets, whatever. And so knew how to do it. And so, okay, they caught up, but surely nobody can catch up after them. And then very quickly after that, there were a raft of other companies that caught up very fast. And XAI is maybe the best example of that, which is XAI, Elon's company, XAI is the company name, Grok is the consumer product version of it. XAI basically caught up to, state-of-the-art OpenAI Anthropic level in less than 12 months from a standing start, right? And so, and again, that kind of argues against any kind of permanent lead, right, by any one incumbent that's just going to basically be able to lock the entire market down. If you can catch up like that, and then as we've discussed, the China part is all new in the last year, right? The DeepSeek, the DeepSeek moment, I think, was in January or February of this year, right? So less than 12 months ago. And now you've got 4 Chinese companies that have effectively caught up. And so, so it's all right. I mean, again, these are trillion-dollar questions, not answers, but it's just wow, okay. It's one of these things where once somebody proves that it's capable, it seems to not be that hard for other people to be able to catch up, even people with far less resources. And so, I don't know what that does. Maybe it makes you slightly more skeptical in the long run economics of the big players. On the other hand, maybe it makes you more bullish about the startup ecosystem. It certainly should make you more bullish about startup application companies, right? Being able to do interesting things, which is why we're so excited about that. It should make you probably, a bit more excited about certainly about China. On the other hand, the Chinese competition putting pressure on the American system to not screw itself up is very positive. So it should probably make you a little bit more bullish on the U.S. And so I think these are live dynamics, and I think we still need more time to pass before we know the exact answer. I should say this sometimes they freak people out when I say these are open questions. When a company is confronted with fundamentally open strategic or economic questions, it's often a big problem because a company needs to have a strategy, and the strategy needs to be very specific. And a company has to make very specific, concrete choices about where it deploys investment dollars and personnel, and the strategy has to be logical and coherent, or the company kind of collapses into chaos. And so companies need to answer these questions, and if they get the answers wrong, they're really in trouble. Venture, we have our issues in venture, but a huge advantage that we have is we don't have to. We can bet on multiple strategies at the same time, right? And we are doing this. So we are betting on big models and small models and proprietary models and open source models, right? And foundation models and applications, right? And consumer and enterprise. And so the portfolio approach, the nature of it is we are aggressively, we are aggressively investing behind every strategy that we've identified that we think has a plausible chance of working, even when that's contradictory to another strategy that we're investing in. And one is just the world's messy, and probably a bunch of things are going to work, and so there's not going to be clean yes or no answers to a bunch of this. A lot of the answers to this, I think, are just going to be and answers. But the other is if one of these strategies doesn't work, we're not trying to hedge per se, but we're going to have representation in the portfolio of the alternate strategy, and so we're going to have multiple ways to win. So anyway, that's the goal. That's the theory of why we are kind of taking the approach in the space that we're taking, and that's why I have a big smile on my face when I say that there are these big open questions, because I think that actually works to our advantage.
It's a good seg to A16Z questions, because we've gotten a few in so far, and we have a few that were send-ins ahead as well. So I'll start one with a broad topic. What is something you and Ben disagree and commit on?
Disagree and commit. We agree. I mean, we as Ben and I was just say, we're an old married couple, so we argue constantly. But we're
the romance is dead.
The romance is long dead. Yes. The fire has long since gone out. But yes, yes, we're in the park squabbling all the time. So look, we debate everything. We argue about everything. That said, one of the things that's made our partnership work is we do tend to come to the same conclusion. Like each of us is open to being persuaded by the other one, and so we end up coming to the same conclusion most of the time. So I would say there aren't I would say specifically sitting here today, there are zero issues where I'm sitting here and I'm like, I can't believe, I can't believe I'm putting up with this crazy thing on his part that he's doing, that I really disagree with, but I feel like I have to commit to, or I don't think vice versa. And so we don't have any of those. Quite honestly, the biggest thing that he and I discuss. By the way, this is not the most important thing we're doing, but it is a topic since somebody asked the question. The biggest thing he and I discuss, where I don't know, maybe I'm always second guessing myself, or I never quite know where I should come out on it, that he and I talked about a lot, is just basically the public footprint of the company. So our presence in the world in terms of public statements, controversy, how we vocalize and express our views on things. And I would just say there's a tension. It's maybe obvious, but a very important tension. Generally speaking, the more out there we are, and the more outspoken we are, and the more controversial we are, the better for the business, in the sense of the entrepreneurs love it. The founders want to work with. This is very clear at this point. The founders want to work with people who basically are brave and controversial and take controversial stands and articulate things clearly. And they want that for a bunch of reasons. One is because it's a demonstration of courage, which they appreciate. But the other is because it teaches them who we are before they even meet us. And that has just proven to be just this incredible competitive advantage. The long-term LPs will know, this is why we started with a very active marketing strategy from the very beginning. And it completely worked. The whole thing was, if we're able to broadcast our message and we're able to basically be very clear in what we believe, even to the point where it's controversial, the best founders in the world are going to understand us before they even walk in the door, right? And they're going to know us even before they've met us, as opposed to everybody else in venture, at least at the time, that was basically just keeping everything quiet, where the founder just has no idea who these people are and what they believe. And so that worked incredibly well. It continues to work incredibly well. It's, by the way, it's it's generally true across the industry. It's generally the case. On the other hand, there are externalities to being publicly visible and to being controversial on many fronts. I would say this, we're trying very hard to thread this needle. So we're not backing off of generally being a company that does a lot of outbound. Eric Thornburg and the team that he's built, that we've talked to you guys about in the past, is already off to the races. We're tripling down on the idea of basically being the leaders and articulating the tech and business issues that matter. The issues for sure that people need to be able to understand. And that's proven to be very effective. By the way, a fair amount of our comms are actually aimed at Washington, because again, it's if you're a policymaker in Washington and you're sitting there 3,000 miles away, and your entire information source is East Coast newspapers that hate Silicon Valley, that's bad. And so, our ability to broadcast, informed points of view on technology, we meet people in DC all the time who say, yeah, most of what I know about this topic I learned from you guys because I listened to the podcast, I read the articles, I watched the YouTube channel. And so, we're going to continue to do that. And so we, overall, we have we're kind of on our front foot on that stuff. But yeah, he and I do go back and forth a bit on exactly how many third rail topics should we touch, and how frequently. And I would say we are trying to moderate that.
As Elizabeth Taylor said, as long as I spell our name right, it's oftentimes could be good in most scenarios, particularly when it comes to little tech. WESS. And also, I think embedded in that question is probably some degree of the relationship that you and Ben have, which is now going on 30 plus years at this point. So much so that Marc has become one person representing both. Some people refer to Marc as Andreessen Horowitz. No, lost the Marc, have combined just into one person.
Yes.
That's the result of 30 plus years working together. Okay. So it's been 2 years since you've reorganized around AI, launched AD. What do you think you got most right? And in hindsight, is there anything that you underestimated or missed in that decisioning process?
No, I mean, look, we made plenty of mistakes. I think those were the right calls. I mean, AI was like I said, like the whole theory. To back up, the whole theory of venture that we've had from the beginning is that many people before us have had as well. That's very correct. I think is the whole theory is like the money in venture is made when there's like a fundamental architecture shift, like when there's like a fundamental change in the technology landscape, and that's been true for in venture basically forever. And the reason is because if you have a fundamental change in technology, then you have this period of creativity in which you can have basically aggressive, very aggressive kind of people, kind of start these new companies, and they have this kind of shot to kind of come in and you kind of win categories before big companies can respond. If there's no fundamental change in technology, it's very hard to make startups work because the big companies just end up doing everything. And so venture kind of kind of lives or dies on the basis of these waves of these transitions. And so there's always this question. It's always this question. I mean, I would just say the best venture capital firms in history, I think, are the ones that were the most aggressive at being able to navigate from wave to wave, right? And look, I was a beneficiary of this when I came to Silicon Valley in 1994. There was no venture firm in 1994 that was like the internet venture capital firm. Like it just didn't exist. But there were a set of venture capital firms at the time, our firm, Kleiner Perkins, that said, oh, this is a new architecture. This is a new technology change. It seems totally crazy. Everybody says you can't make money on it. Whatever. These kids are nuts, but like, we're going to make those bets. And so they were willing to invest. And by the way, KP in the 90s invested not only in us, but also in Amazon and in Google and like, company after company after company. They invested in At Home, which basically made home broadband work. They invested in a fleet of companies, and they were a venture capital firm that had started in the 1970s around what was at the time called mini computers, which was like 3 generations of technology back. And they had navigated from wave to wave. And the same thing is true for Sequoia. The same thing's true for basically any successful venture firm that's been in business for 30 or 40 or 50 years. And so I think in this business, like of all businesses, like you need to get onto the new thing. It was, I mean, quite honestly, it was, I think, pretty amazing that most of the venture ecosystem just decided to sit crypto out. And the number of VCs that we talked to between, call it, the release of the Bitcoin white paper in 2009 to the beginning of the crypto war in 2021, who just basically said, "Oh, we're not going to do crypto." It was fairly. I never quite know what to do with a VC who says, "Oh, there's a new wave of technology, and I'm very deliberately not going to participate in it." And I'm always like, is that not the job, right? Like, so like I was fairly amazed by the VCs that didn't make the jump to crypto. They looked briefly smart during the crypto wars, I would say, of the last 3 or 4 years, and I think they probably look maybe a little bit less smart now. AI is another one of these where there are certain firms that are jumping all over it, and there are certain firms that are just kind of sitting back and letting it happen. And by the way, there were certain firms that never made it to the internet. I mean, there were firms that were very well known in the 80s and very successful that just like did not make the jump to the internet and basically just petered out. And so anyway, long-winded way of saying, I think in this business of all businesses, you have to jump on the new wave. And I think we got the magnitude of it right, that this is like a fundamental transformation inside the firm. AD is doing great. AD itself, I believe, is also a beneficiary of AI. Right, because in 2 ways. One is a lot of the kinds of products that AD companies build themselves benefit from AI, and then also AI is a driver of demand in other sectors of AD, like energy and materials. And so I think that generally is very consistent and is working well. By the way, crypto's back to being I would say an exciting industry as a consequence of all the policy changes. And then there's even going to be, I think, intersections. I think there's actually going to be quite a few intersections between AI and crypto. And then biotech also, bio and healthcare, I think are obviously going to be transformed by AI, both on the healthcare side and on the actual drug discovery side. And that's underway. And so anyway, so like the individual efforts in the firm feel good and suitable for the time. The interactions between the teams and the hybrid ideas, the companies that are coming at these things from multiple angles, feels really good. Maybe the corollary question is like, what do we feel like we're missing right now? And I think the answer is really not like, I don't think like right now we're not missing a vertical. Like I don't like as of right now, like there's not like a specific vertical of like, I don't know, whatever that like where we just like, oh, we just need, we need the equivalent of a new unit or the equivalent of a new, new fund or whatever. I don't see that at the moment. I think it's more executing extremely well in the verticals that we have in front of us, and then being the best possible partner to the portfolio companies.
Yeah, actually, on the point of AD, because AI is creating, there's a lot of talk around AI taking jobs, et cetera. Ironically enough, the jobs in AD sectors have never been more in demand in the physical world, related to energy, related obviously to data center build out, et cetera. So like the pendulum, it seems like also is swinging from just an accelerant standpoint from a society point of view. You talked about the importance of society also needing to be ready for tech adoption. Like, have you seen that accelerating of recently? What's your sentiment of how to actually increase that, just to also make sure the convergence of adoption also falls in line with how quickly tech is actually being implemented?
Yeah. So, look, we've talked about this before, but, look, for a very long time, tech was just not a very relevant. Look, if you go back over 300 years, there's just recurring waves of total panic and freak out caused by new technology. Or even you can go back 500 years, you can go back to the printing press, which basically was hand in hand with the sort of creation of Protestantism, which really changed things. And then, you go back to, there were just always kind of, continuous panics. There have been multiple waves of automation panics for the last 200 years. A lot of the foundational panic under Marxism was basically a fear of the elimination of jobs through the application of automation. A lot of the same arguments you hear today about AI is going to centralize all the wealth in a handful of a few people, and everybody else is going to be poor and immiserated. That basically is what Marx used to say, which I think was, by the way, wrong then and is wrong now, which we could talk about. But and then even in the 1960s, there was this whole panic around AI replacing all the jobs. There's this great, it's long forgotten, but it was a big deal at the time during the Johnson administration. You read these AI pause letters today. This one that just came out a few weeks ago that Prince Harry headlined, of all people. He talks about AI is going to ruin everything, and it's like. So it's 1964. There was basically a group of the leading lights in academia, science, and kind of public affairs. There was this thing called the Triple Committee, or the Committee for the Triple Revolution. If you do a Google search on, it's like Committee for the Triple Revolution, Johnson White House, or whatever, this thing will pop up. And it was a very similar kind of manifesto of we need to stop the march of technology today, or we're going to ruin everything. And then even in the course of the last 20 years, there was a big panic around actually outsourcing in the 2000s was going to take all the jobs, and then it was actually robots, weirdly enough, in the 2010s, which is amazing because robots didn't even work in the 2010s, and they kind of still don't. But there's a panic around that, and now there's kind of whatever level of AI panic. And so I would just say look, the way I would describe it is we in Silicon Valley have always wanted the work that we do to matter. We spend most of our time, quite honestly, with people telling us that everything that we're doing is stupid and won't work. That's the default position. And then basically that flips at some point into panic about how it's going to ruin everything. It's easy sitting out here to be cynical about that, especially when you kind of see the patterns over time. My view is we need to be actually very respectful of that, and we need to be very aware of that, and basically that we. I use the metaphor with the dog that caught the bus. We always wanted to work on things that matter. We are working on things that matter. People in the rest of society actually really do care about these things. And it's our responsibility to think that all through very carefully and to do a good job, both not just building the technology, but also explaining it. Look, I think we have a real obligation to really explain ourselves and engage on these issues. In terms of how to measure how it's going, it's sort of the classic social science question, which is okay, if you want to understand basically, patterns of people, there's basically two ways to understand what people are doing and thinking. One is to ask them, and then the other is to watch them. And every social scientist, every sociologist will tell you this, which basically is you can ask people, right, and the way you do that, right, is surveys, focus groups, polls. What they think. But then you can watch them, and you can do what's called reveal preferences, or just observe behavior, which is you can actually watch their behavior. And what you often see in many areas of human activity, including politics and many different aspects of society and culture over time, is the answers that you get when you ask people are very different than the answers that you get when you watch them. And the reason is because, you could have a bunch of theories as to why this is. The Marxists claim that people have false consciousness. The explanation I believe is just people have opinions on all kinds of things, particularly when they're in a context where they get to express themselves, and they'll have a tendency to kind of express themselves in very heated ways. And then if you just watch their behavior, they're often a lot calmer. and a lot more measured and a lot more rational in what they do. And so the AI that's playing out in AI right now, which is if you run a survey or a poll of what, for example, American voters think about AI, it's just like they're all in a total panic. It's like, oh my God, this is terrible. This is awful. It's going to kill all the jobs. It's going to ruin everything, the whole thing. If you watch the revealed preferences, they're all using AI. So they're downloading the apps. They're using ChatGPT in their job. They're, having an argument. You see this online all the time now. I'm having an argument with my boyfriend or girlfriend. I don't understand what's happening. I take the text exchange, I cut and paste it into ChatGPT, and I have ChatGPT explain to me what my partner is thinking and tell me how I should answer, so that he or she is not mad at me anymore, right? So, or I have this thing, I have a skin condition, and doctors, and I take a photo and I feed it, and I'm finally learning about my own health, or I use it in my job. I had to get this report ready for Monday morning and I ran out of time, and ChatGPT really saved my bacon. And so people in their daily lives are, you just look at the data. It's just like they are not only using this technology, they love this technology. And they love it, and they're adopting it as fast as they possibly can. And so I tend to think we're going to with the public discussion, this is going to ping pong back and forth for a while, because there is this divergence between what people are saying and what people are doing. But I do think that what people are doing part is obviously the part ultimately that wins. And I think this, by the way, I think this technology is going to be exactly the same as every other one, which is the thing that's going to happen here is this is just going to proliferate really broadly. It's going to freak everybody out, and then 20 years from now, everybody's going to be like, oh, thank God, we've got it. Wouldn't life be miserable if we didn't have this? Or 5 years from now, or 1 year from now, people are going to reach that conclusion. So I'm very optimistic about where this lands. It's just that there will be turbulence along the way.
I'm smiling because I also witnessed that in the wild. Literally late last week, I was on the plane. The guy next to me was talking to his ChatGPT. I could see him, and he was like, help me draft an escalation letter to United for the delay on this flight. I was like, sir, you are on the flight right now. At least wait until it's over. It was very good, though. I'm sure he had a great email crafted as a part of that. So, okay, I'm going to switch gears to a few fun questions that were sent in that is intended to be a lightning round. So, what is something you've changed your mind on recently? Bonus points if it was someone younger than you.
I mean, it's like every day. It's just a constant. It's almost all what's in the realm of the possible. I'm terrible at specific examples, so I don't have one ready at hand. But like I said, it's always, it's often somebody showing up. It's either something somebody writes or something somebody says. It's almost it's very frequently somebody who's very young. It's just I would say it's a routine experience.
Good way to stay young. Do you plan? Speaking of young, do you plan to be cryogenically frozen?
Not with current cryogenic technology. The track record of that is not great. The stories are somewhat horrifying, but we'll see. We'll see. We still got some time.
How do you stay grounded when your influence itself may distort reality around you?
Yeah. So I was to say the good news, I would say the good news on several fronts. So one is, look, the concern is real, and it's hard for me to talk about with sort of my Midwestern, Midwesterners. We either are very humble or we're really good at faking it. But it's hard to talk about, but it requires some introspection. But yeah, I mean, look, the reality warping effect is definitely real. By the way, there is a very big advantage to the reality warping effect, which is being able to get people to do what you want them to do. So that there is another side to it. But it is a concern in terms of having an actual accurate understanding of what's happening. I guess I'd say two things. I would say one is, one is just, my partners, I think, are quite, including Ben, are quite forthright in telling me when I'm wrong. But, more generally, we are very exposed to reality. And again, you mentioned, I don't know, it's a way to stay young or make sure that our hair never grows back or whatever. It's just we run these experiments, because we make these decisions about whether to invest or not invest, and we work with these companies and all their things. And reality kicks in quickly. The delusions don't last very long in this business, because these things either work or they don't. And you have these long, elaborate, discussions about, theories on this and that and the other thing. And then reality just completely smacks you square in the face, you idiot, right? What were you this is the ultimate frustration of business, which is also very motivating, which is the number of times that you think that you've applied superior analysis, and then you've either invested or not invested based on that analysis. And it turns out it was just the analysis was just completely wrong. right? And you just like completely overrated your ability to epistemically, kind of analyze these things. You just, basically inflicted harm. Like I always, the question is always, it's sort of, any activity that we do, is it value add or is it actually value subtract, right? And I think in this business of all businesses, it's kind of like that, and that applies to all of my own contributions as well. So there is that, and then I would say, maybe the final thing is just like I do have the entire internet ready to tell me that I'm an idiot. So that also that also doesn't hurt, and it does on a regular basis.
On the point of you're alluding to earlier about decisions on investing in companies, my favorite line, I think it was from the Cheeky Pint interview that you did, was, when you invest in a company, it doesn't go well, at least it goes bankrupt, right? If it does well and it does fantastically well, you hear about it every single fucking day.
For the rest of your life. Yeah, for the next 30 years. Reality smacking you in the face saying, you fool. You had it. It's literally, you had it in your office. All you had to do was say yes. And by the way, and this is the thing, like every great VC, like this is the stories that, the VCs tell each other. Every great VC basically has this history of like, my God, I had it. It was in my office. The thing was in my office and I said no. And if I had just said yes. And so it's very hard to, yes, the constant reminders in the Wall Street Journal and on CNBC every day that you made a giant mistake. Is yes, very good for the old humility factor.
Yeah, very, very humbling. Helps you stay grounded all the time. Last question: do you plan to go to Mars if and when that opportunity presents itself?
Probably not.
My subliminal Zoom background wasn't sending you the positive vibes. This is what.
I'm not even willing to leave California. So I'm barely willing to leave my house. So, yeah, I don't. Maybe by VR.
Yeah.
And then we'll see what happens. I mean, look. Having said that, I think Elon's going to pull it off. And so I think I don't know. I don't know exactly. I don't want to predict. This is not a prediction, but I would not be surprised if within a decade there's routine trips back and forth. So yeah, we may. This may actually become a practical question. And by the way, I do know a lot of people who are probably going to go.
Myself included. Put me on that.
Oh, fantastic. Good.
The flights around the world have prepared me for the 6-month journey to Mars, so I will be just fine.